Good. Welcome to Wayfarers Chapel, a national memorial to Emanuel Swedenborg. Today we're very excited to continue our speaker series with a renowned speaker. Our theme today is bringing heaven to earth, how spiritual entrepreneurs must lead social change. Let me share a little bit about our speaker. He is the founder and president of a strategy company called The Public Squared, which is focused on training social entrepreneurs on how to succeed at their purpose-solving social problems. This past week, he led the pitch day for the Orange County Social Entrepreneur Competition, and he'll lead a similar event in Detroit next week. Our speaker chairs the Wayfarers Chapel Board and holds an undergraduate degree in philosophy and a graduate degree in theology from Harvard University. Please welcome Richard Tafel.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Wayfarers Chapel is probably definitely one of my most favorite places in the whole world. So it's just a great honor for me to be here today. It's a beautiful day, a sunny day, not too hot in California, and I'm hoping to talk about a pretty heavy-duty topic. How do we change the world? So I think it's something we all think about. I think we all want to make the world a better place. I think at times, though, particularly lately, we're beginning to ask ourselves, like, can we do it? Or how does it get done? Or how does change take place? And so we often find ourselves sort of banging our head against the wall saying, we're trying these things and it's not working. And so I'm going to be offering some theory, some ideas. I don't think they've been presented anywhere before, at least I haven't. So your feedback will be very important. I plan to keep it very interactive so that if I get on a topic and it's not clear what I'm saying, please feel free just to say, I'm not following you, or could you explain that? Happy to do that. And then I've dedicated a bunch of time for Q&A at the end, where I really hope we can get into a discussion, because Jonathan in his message this morning said he can answer any question as long as I don't know is a good answer, and we're really making this up as we go along, to be honest. So I don't think anybody has the answers, but I think collectively listening to each other we'll get closer to the answers. So I'm putting this forward as my thought about how we might see the world and how we might actually change it. And it involves, to me, the ultimate goal of a spiritual person is to bring heaven to earth, and the people who do that are spiritual entrepreneurs, but I'll explain that as we go along. Any questions before I begin? So far, so good? Okay. All right. So the summary of what I want to talk about is that we are facing tremendous challenges in the world today. The leadership style and models and solutions that we're bringing to it, we know are not working. So we need new leadership models to solve the world's problems. And I'm going to talk about what they might look like. So before I even go to this slide, let me ask you, what do you think are the greatest challenges facing the world? Anybody? Big issue facing the world right now. Pardon me? Lack of love. Excellent. Anything else? Hunger is an issue in the world, right? People are hungry. Another big issue in the world. Anything else? Pardon me? Violence in the world. We still have war. Pardon me? Healthcare is a huge issue in the world that we're facing, right? If you think globally, what are the other big issues? Water. Homelessness, water. Health. Pardon me? Health. Healthcare, right. Sexism. It's a big issue. How we treat each other, how men treat women. Anything else? GMO. So, GMO, our food. Okay, you peeked at my notes. She said we need to go from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. Brilliant. But it's a problem because we are self-centered right now. Did anybody else have a?
Radicalism.
Right, radicalism, terrorism, issues like that. Lack of tolerance is a huge issue, right? People are killing each other.
Spiritual, non-spiritual intelligence.
Boy, These folks have already read my notes. Absolutely. That's a big issue. People who don't look at the world at all with any spiritual intelligence or even know what that phrase means. Greed and materialism, financial issues, right? The gap between the rich and the poor and our economic systems in the world.
Self-centeredness versus empathy.
Right. This whole idea that we're not looking outward at others and showing compassion, but we're all about ourselves. So it didn't take you long to come up with a lot of world problems, right? They're on the tip of your tongue and they're on your mind. So what I did, I actually looked at, for the United States, Gallup posed that question, and I wanted to see what the American public, the number one issue Americans described was the economy, and that had a whole bunch of issues, but they meant, you know, fragility of the economy. Another one, the second biggest issue for people in the United States was political dysfunction, the breakdown of our current political system. Number two, first time it's ever been that high. Unemployment, immigration, foreign affairs, particularly war, moral decline came in at number 6. The deficit, healthcare, and terrorism. So that's in the United States. That's Gallup's. They divide it into economic and non-economic. But it's interesting. You named every one of those things in your comments. And then it's also interesting to look at Europe and the World Economic Forum and more global. So globally, people are also worried about fiscal issues in the world economy, poverty rated higher, climate and climate change and radical climate. Political dysfunction, again, number 4 globally, terrorism and epidemics. And maybe in the last month with the Ebola virus, maybe epidemics might be increasing for people as a concern. So, a lot of problems, you named them, you're very aware of them. So, do you see a common theme in any of these problems? Epidemics, you see terrorists, the political dysfunction, climate change, selfishness and meaninglessness, war, you know, do we see any theme in what's going on in the world? Anybody? Not a right or wrong answer. So just to make sure, and I want to make sure everybody hears what you're saying, compassion for other would address all those issues. And is that a strategy that we're currently engaging in any of these? The compassion offensive. So you're right, that's a very common theme. The other theme, if you look at it from a leadership style, what kind of leadership are we bringing to this? To your point, we're bringing old leadership styles. As you said, it was compassion. I think you're right, but we're really trying to solve very complex problems in the world now with outdated models. Okay? And there's this famous quote from Einstein that most of you have probably heard, but I love it. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used to in creating them. It requires a new level of thinking to deal with these complex problems. These are very complex problems. It's going to require a different level of solution. With me so far? Any questions? So, how we approach problems, and I'm going to be speaking mainly from the viewpoint of the United States, which I'm most familiar with. But the way we tend to do it, I have a picture of a general there, George Washington, on his horse, the sword. It's very hierarchical, top down, a very military model. Someone's in charge, they tell us what to do, we follow them. Win, lose. For us to win, we must destroy the enemy. For my business to succeed, I have to knock your business out. For me to succeed personally, I've got to push you away. So we have a very much win-lose. We see this very much in political dysfunction. For me to succeed as a Republican, I must destroy the Democrat. For me to succeed as a Democrat, it's very polarized. And so that thinking permeates how we approach problems. We think in duality. If I can push you down, I can solve it. We also think in the nation-state model, right? We tend not to solve things saying what would be good for the world. We say, right, when you read the news, how many people have gotten Ebola in Africa? How many Americans? Any guess? 2, 3, right? 3. How many Africans have had Ebola? We're not that familiar with that number, really. because we get, so when someone gets killed in battle, we know how many American soldiers get killed. When we talk about immigration, we say things like, when you cross this border, you're a person on this side, but you're not a person on this side. So we have a nation state. It's a really old model, if you think about it. But it really defines how we think, what we know, based on our country. It's very much of a business model. People talk in terms of finances, right? When they talk about how we're going to approach a problem, what's it cost, how we're going to do it, what we're going to do as a business model. And this sort of plays off of what somebody had said earlier when I first asked about world thinking. Right now, the dominant thinking is very much scientific materialism. So, for example, earlier you had said if we had more compassion. Imagine taking that into a meeting room of strategists in our government and said all you need is love and spirituality and a different spirituality. That's not how we operate. We operate with what's the science is going to solve this. And it's very materialistic. It's here and now. And it's great that you might have your spirituality, but you might want to check it at the door because we're very sophisticated, smart people solving things through science. So that's how we approach problems. I'm going to argue we need a new operating system to solve problems in the world. I'm saying that we need a collaborative way of thinking. I think we have to look at strategies as win-win-win. I'm thinking that we need global consciousness versus nation state. That across sector consciousness, right now in our country, we say that is a medical problem, that is an education problem, that is a poverty problem, that is an immigration problem, that is a military problem. I'm basically going to argue that we've got to cross sectors. We've got to stop thinking in these silos. Cross-border. So right now, we literally, immigration is a very hot issue right now. We literally do think that we can solve it by pushing people across a line, and that's going to solve an issue. And somehow it's not our problem anymore. And then finally, to some of the points people were making earlier, I really do think that we need a spiritual approach to solving these problems that will sound to, in my town, Washington, D.C., where I do strategy, that would be the most radical of all the ideas that will people be like, oh, okay. Nice, Rich, thank you very much, and let's move on to the next person. And finally, a facilitator style. A style that actually brings all the voices in the room in on the solution, as opposed to telling everybody in the room what their role is. So it's a very different way of approaching it. So, right now I'm asking what we measure. This is a young lady in her terrible twos. We measure you by your age. There was a time when we treated children as adults. And only in the last 100 years have we had developmental theory where we say, at 2, you can expect that behavior. At 16, you can expect that behavior. So we understand human development now. We can measure you. We can also measure your income. In fact, in American culture, if I ask you, how was your year last year? In many parts of American culture, that means how much did you make? Was your finances successful? Didn't ask about your loving relationships or other things, but how are things going? Finances. So we can measure income. Education. People can tell you, I've got a master's in this or a doctorate in that, or I got this. And so we completely categorize people by that measurement. Age is the way we obviously measure people. The psychological development is really knowing the different age levels. Intelligence we can measure through IQ. Number of reports. A lot of people tell me, I say, what's the most important thing? I have 40 people who report to me. So if you're not getting the message, I'm very important because I have other people below me in the system. Profit loss, maybe the easiest way. Are you profitable or not? If you're profitable. So we measure those things. If we're going to move to a different level of consciousness and a different level of leadership, we have to begin to learn how to measure that. Someone had mentioned earlier we don't know how to measure spiritual intelligence. What is that? How do we measure it? That's exactly the right question. So we don't measure it, we don't know it, and if we don't know it, we really can't evolve and act on it. I'm basically arguing it in the same way that the world is evolving around us scientifically, and we also are going to have to evolve spiritually and in our consciousness to rise up, and we need to be able to measure that. So how do you measure consciousness? Well, actually, a lot of people have taken a stab at it. There's a guy named Fowler who measured the levels of faith development in the last 50 years. And there's all these various ways that people are starting to try to measure consciousness. It's not so much important that you can see the actual slide, but you get the idea. We're starting to see, and what this slide is interesting is this puts them all on one slide, and I'm happy to give everybody the slides afterward. But the point is, people are kind of saying the same thing. People evolve at different levels, and we're starting to be able to measure it and do it. So measuring consciousness. Now what's interesting for this location, since this building is a national monument to Emanuel Swedenborg, let me do a quick commercial on him. He was actually one of the first thinkers in the world, spiritual thinkers, who actually said, the book of Genesis, you all take it literally as a creation story. It's not literally a creation story. It's not a scientific creation story. It's a story about personal development. And each of the days of creation is a level of spiritual development. That was a radical idea. It's still radical today. And he talks about these are successive states of growth for human beings. So way ahead of his time. And this is something I would argue is not that understood even in the Swedenborgian denomination or among Swedenborgians, that he came up with this theory. Just very quickly, so you hear his. He starts, darkness is before you start to grow, differentiation. And he gets all the way to day 7, where he says you're at harmony and rest. That you are actually, because you are in, you could say, Christ consciousness, God can rest because you are in harmony with yourselves. And he actually said that very few people move very far up this on earth. So the idea of measuring this is not completely new. And this guy did it in 1750s. The handout that I gave to you is probably, I think, one of the most interesting measures of personal development. And let me just stop there. Any questions so far? A lot of information, so still with me? So how do you measure development? And this is from, it's from integral theory. If you've ever heard of Ken Wilber or spiral dynamics. But the important thing is, this is probably one of the most interesting maps of consciousness. And I think this will become known to everybody in the future. But it basically makes this argument. Consciousness has developed going back to, the early time when it was archaic. It then went to indigenous, tribal, traditional, modern, and postmodern. And those are the levels of consciousness for most of the world. And then you see those 3 at the top, which are more integral levels. And it's basically, the argument of this theory is that the world is moving to this next level, integral. At integral, we'll be able to begin to solve world's problems. At the levels below it, we will not have, these are not complex enough to solve world problems. This map should be really interesting because when you get to know it, you can actually start watching the news and start to understand some of the debates that are going on. So if I would just, we all know, right now in the United States, we're probably divided along traditional folks, modern folks, and postmodern folks. So what might they look like in daily life? Let me see, does anybody have a guess? If you're at the traditional level, anybody have a guess of maybe what news program you might want to watch? If you're, pardon me? Fox News is probably here at traditional and modern. If you're postmodern, what news station might you want to watch? Pardon me? Democracy Now, right. Democracy Now, which is a very progressive station. And so the traditional person, each of these levels really helped move the world to a new level of consciousness better than the last one. And they all have value within them. So it's not one's, they're bad. They're just different levels of evolution. When you have these levels and you don't understand it, you can't, many of our disputes right now are people who are talking at their level and not hearing the other level. The other thing about this theory is that whatever level you're at, you tend to dislike, green and below, you tend to dislike the level that came before you because you evolved away from it. So these 3 in the United States right now are at war with each other, these 3 levels. They really don't like each other. The green group has kind of brought us the civil rights movement. They've been very relativistic, but the green level is also generally very anti-spirituality. So many of you might be green in that level, that postmodern, but if you're spiritual, sometimes people will, that can be sometimes uncomfortable. Modern folks are the capitalists, the business people. Again, they have a more, and they often have a very traditional religious experience. And then traditional folks tend to be what you might say is a fundamentalist religious experience, but religion is probably most important, or religious life might be taking place at the greatest level for traditional folks. Does that make sense so far? So you begin to see all the conflicts. So now you take that globally. We have people globally operating at tribal, traditional. When we try to solve a problem by bringing our level of consciousness to their level without understanding their level, there's going to be a clash. So, for example, the United States in the Middle East would come into a culture that might be tribal or traditional, trying to move to modern. Very often we'll put a postmodern agenda on them, and it's not going to be sustained once we pull out, because it didn't grow developmentally up. Does that make sense? So obviously, one of the biggest challenges we talked about earlier, terrorism, our solution is going to still probably be a win-lose, drone strike approach, crush it, and we'll end up really playing a whack-a-mole where you shoot it down here, it's going to pop up here, because we're not dealing with the developmental levels. We're pushing onto it. So I'm arguing that we're going to need this higher level of development, which I would call our spiritual entrepreneurs. What's fascinating about people who operate at this level is they actually can speak the language at every level below. They actually love and respect everybody at every level below. And it's not that they're strategic in being able to speak it, they can actually get into the heart of the person at that level. And they'll be trusted by people at that level because they'll know they're the real deal. So this is where world changes are going to come from in the future, a very different model. Still follow me? Any questions? Oh, they came online in the world how many years ago? So when did they start? So you'll see that they're claiming for some of this integral theory would say that these are brand new. But even postmodern as a way of thinking is really only the last 50 years, and mainly in, more so in parts of Scandinavia, but in the United States as well. Any other questions? That was a great question. Okay, so the big question is, if we need this level of development, how do we get there? Are you able to plot yourself as you're listening to this on any of these levels? Anybody able to see kind of where they fit in? It's kind of neat to have a map of yourself and see where you might fall in. I've done a lot of politics in Washington, and I've tried to, for a long time I tried to merge traditional, which would be Republican, with sort of postmodern, which would be AIDS funding or gay rights. What's interesting about doing that is once I tell somebody that in Washington, they'll immediately tell me what level they're at. If they're at traditional, they'll be very angry about gay rights or AIDS. They'll immediately say it. I don't support that. I think it's terrible, it's disgusting, and it's a move in the wrong direction. But if they're postmodern, they'll respond to the Republican. Immediately, having no idea anything about me, will immediately have a series of judgments about Republicans. So this group really cannot stand the Tea Party. This group is very fearful of what the Green is doing to the country. They feel it's destroying it, making it Europe, you know. And that's when we see this political tension. This is really a fight for consciousness. I can't compromise because I'd be giving my country away to these terrible people at this higher level. These people at the higher level say, these bigots, we've just got to outgrow them. Hopefully they'll die off and the next generation will be better. So if you hear any of yourself in those languages, you can see how these issues really elicit different viewpoints. So for the first time in history, we're reaching a new level of consciousness that embraces the previous levels. Remember I said earlier, in the past, they've all said whoever came before me is wrong. This one actually can see value in each one. That's a big step, and that's how we're going to solve it.
Sorry, have you taken into account also, where people are growing up and how that leads them to certain levels in which they are?
So you mean what part of the world or what part of the...
Yeah, exactly, because, I lived in, some of the red states, and the level of consciousness is, falls in line with more traditional things of that sort, and then growing up also in California, the green and then the lighter green and blue. So,
Yeah, so I'm making it a little, just to hear the question. So what about different parts of the world? What about different parts of the country? Does that affect? It absolutely affects it, because when you're in a culture, you'll very much mesh to the level the culture is in. We have seen that if people move to a more red state in the United States, they vote more red after a time because they kind of want to fit in with the group. The same with green state, the red-blue divide in the United States, but the different levels. But also, this is just measuring consciousness and spiritual development is going to be challenging for us because we have all different kinds of intelligences. Someone said measuring spiritual intelligence. We measure human intelligence, spiritual intelligence. We can measure your financial intelligence. What I have found, I've done a lot of work, for example, in Africa. I've always found the spiritual intelligence when I'm doing the program there, the people, there's a joy and a spirituality that surpasses anything I've ever experienced in the West. If spirituality is more important, and they were suffering in the worst possible situation. So I was there doing work on the AIDS crisis. So horrendous, and if I talk too much about it, I'll get emotional. It was that moving. But the joy and the spiritual, and it was not a naive, it was a deep spirituality that what's important and God's role in the universe and all that. So these levels have different growth at different places in the world, but their culture was definitely tribal. Absolutely, they would talk in terms of tribal, trying to move to modern. So it can vary within even societies and cultures. So in my suggestion is the new leadership consciousness that we'll need is collaborative leadership. Right now we think of a leader many times as someone who's going to lead us forward. I'm predicting that the new leader is the great facilitator. Imagine a politician whose job it was to make sure everybody in their district was heard, as opposed to someone driven by ego who wants to be the center of attention, wants to be driving the limousine through my town, Washington, D.C., with motorcades and the attention and the power, that energy, I'm arguing, is not going to be helpful. I'm arguing that it's going to be the person who sometimes doesn't get their opinion heard because they can facilitate the discussion of a larger group. And that's going to also, we're going to have to get beyond nation-state thinking and think globally. How do people win in the equation outside of just, this is what's good for us? Because ultimately, I would argue, what's good globally is going to be good for the United States. But right now, we think the United States must win out against those forces instead of thinking win-win. The spiritual guidance, maybe one of the more radical things that I'm saying today is that I actually believe that to get to that level of consciousness is a level of spiritual development. The ability to love everyone at the lower levels, in my opinion, can only take place through spiritual development. It cannot happen intellectually. There is what you might say, you might have heard this phrase in spiritual thought, the long dark night of the soul. And maybe many of you in this room have gone through that, but there is moving beyond yourself. And it's a very difficult thing, and we really don't have many places that teach it. But the compassion required to love everyone along the spectrum is, for me, as a Christian, it's Christ consciousness, and and you can't do it yourself. And you cannot learn it in a classroom. It's not something that can be studied. It is spirit. And finally, it is a win-win-win strategist, someone who can look at a situation and say, in the past it was win-lose, but we could all win in this. What I have found is the great leader of the future will be a translator. I can talk to traditional, and I can talk to postmodern, and I can talk to modern, and I can come up with a solution in your language that will be a win for everybody. But I can speak the language. So they will have not just a facilitator role, but a translator role, imagining what doesn't exist. Very often when I do strategies with groups, they come to me in Washington, they say, how do we beat the oil companies? You know, so it's going to be a win-lose. When I say, well, could there be an environmental strategy where Exxon wins? There's a fritz, and they go, I don't want them to win. I do not want them to win. I will not participate in that. You are selling me out. You're a bad person. Exxon's bad. So therefore, they can't imagine a win for, say, that company in the equation, so it stops the thinking. I've got to destroy them. We've got to stop them. And so much of the strategy that I work with in Washington that's going on right now, people are very happy in strategies that will never succeed, but make them feel good because they're fighting against what they see as evil. Not going to succeed, but evil. Yes, question here. How do you achieve spiritual consciousness? That is really the question. Great question. So, I think that is the million-dollar question of this, where we need to go in the world. We have no place, really, formally, that teaches how to evolve spiritually. When I'm arguing, I don't know if you agree, I think maybe it's the most important skill set. Where would be the most natural place to learn that? Church. How many churches are really teaching spiritual development? I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads. If churches were teaching spiritual development, they'd be full, I think. For those of you who've had success in your own spiritual development, where did you have that experience? Individual? At a seminary? So you had it at a seminary? Alternative churches. Anybody else who's gone through that experience?
I consider my community my home, and I started on my spiritual path.
Absolutely. So it happens in the community. Everything that people are describing here, that my experience is that's how it's happening. People are figuring this out. They're finding small groups. They're finding coaches. They're finding gurus. They're going to retreats. They're looking for someone who can help take them to that new leadership level. And I think answering your question is the fundamental question of our time. We're going to have to find a way to help more people move to that higher level. Understanding all levels and be master translators. When you meet somebody at that level, they're master translators. You can tell them, tell me how a Republican would win on this, and they'll tell you in Republican speak. You say, how would a progressive win on this? They'll tell you in progressive speak. Tell me how a European would win on this. They'll tell you in a European speak. You'll say, but what about South America? How does South America win on this? They'll tell you in a South American speak. What about globally? Now, this is where it gets really crazy. How does ISIS, the terrorist group, how do they win? That fritzes us out until we can start to think and understand what the win is for people who are engaged in sabotage. Terrorism is basically people at the level of development who see no way to win, but believe in their level so much they're willing to blow up the system. They'll sabotage. So right now in our own political system, the two parties have moved to win-lose thinking. Win-lose ultimately moves to lose-lose because I am willing to sabotage the country for me to be right and you to be wrong. And I can't let you win. And so that's where we are. These folks can translate at all levels, understand all levels, and this will have to be the new leadership model for these very complex issues. I'm arguing that these folks are spiritual entrepreneurs. I'm taking entrepreneur, which is a word from the modern level. It's business-like, it's operations, it's, a creative, starting a new business, and spiritual, which is saying that I believe this has to be done with spirit. Connecting to, as some would say, a trusted source, God, spirit, but something, the cosmic force of the universe. Bringing these two together are going to be the spiritual entrepreneurs. Without them, I don't think we're going to have social change. We're going to keep trying old strategies, be unsuccessful, and very frustrated for a while longer. So, looking at those, you remember the original challenges in the world that I talked about in the beginning? I thought it would be fun to look at them through a new paradigm, what a spiritual entrepreneur might approach them. So I'll use the burning globe as climate change. The traditional model would be the United States needs to pass laws or join the Kyoto Protocol or something along those lines. The United States needs to do this and hope that other countries will follow. Frankly, that's not going to work because climate's global. And if China and India are doing something completely different, to the US business person, it puts them at a disadvantage and it doesn't solve the problem. We're going to have to look at climate. We're not going to solve climate issues as a nation, even a few nations. It's going to absolutely require everybody at the table globally to be involved, and which is beyond our imagination right now, but that's the strategy. In the political world, I've mentioned it. We're playing win-lose, and to the degree that we're still invested in it, and you can test with yourself. If you're invested in defeating the other side, you're caught in the old paradigm, crushing the other guys, the win-lose. We're going to have to move to a new political system, a new way of political thinking that does not put two sides against each other, but really does say, your viewpoint, a conservative viewpoint, is extremely valuable to the culture, and a more progressive viewpoint is extremely valuable to the culture. Other viewpoints are extremely valuable to the culture. How can we all do this so that we could all win? It doesn't mean that everybody is the same. It respects differences, but it makes a win for everybody. I mentioned terrorism. We talked about the Ebola virus. If we keep talking about this as an African problem that we're going to do a very small little bit to solve, this will be a US problem. And then we'll react in a panic and we'll be stunned that it came from nowhere. But our response right now should be absolutely globally conscious to it. Drone strikes is the current solution right now for terrorism. It won't be long, folks, before we have drones flying over the United States from other groups. And that's the world we're looking at if we continue with that mindset. And the financial system. The financial system is built very much on a win-lose model. And in some cases, and it's a very I'm a big fan of capitalism, so if that offends you. It has also been harnessed for greed. And in the last cycle, we saw people absolutely not lying to each other as they illegally moved things across the table to each other, got fees for it, and they did fine. And they practically took down our global economy. If we don't shift to a new way of taking social change and marrying it to the business model, we're going to have problems there. All of these are going to require a different level of consciousness, and it's going to require each of us to move to that new level of thinking. And finally, I mentioned that story about being in Africa, and what I was struck by was that people had purpose and meaning, and what I'm struck by in my work in Washington, where I live, is the meaninglessness of life. And I remember trying to get a delegation of congressional staff to go with me to Africa on a trip to see what was going on. This is before, when the AIDS crisis in Africa was just beginning, but no one really knew about it in the United States. And so I am often teased when I come to Capitol Hill by my friends there, my political friends. They say, here comes Rich, big L, loser. He always has loser issues. And what they mean is the issues that you're fighting for, AIDS in Africa, is not going to get any PAC money to my boss. It's not going to give us a point in the next race. I mean, you're not giving me any upside to this. And if I'm a Republican, I'm not probably going to get the black vote. A Democrat might. So how do you sell this to that? How do you take an issue like that and sell it to a group like that? And the answer was really a spiritual message. When we went there, we said, you know what? Are you really happy just simply attacking the other party? Is that why you came to Washington? To a person, they all said, I didn't come here to do that. I believe in what I believe, but I didn't come here just to do this. And I'm worried about the future. Well, why not do something? Come on this trip. It'll change your life. It'll be the best thing you do. It's the only thing you'll remember this whole year, in the midst of all these press releases attacking the other party for not accomplishing anything. So we took a bipartisan delegation, and to this day, I run into the people, and they made it happen, by the way. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I run into the people to this day, and they say, no, it wasn't that biggest thing that happened to me that year. You were wrong. It's the biggest thing that happened in my life. That changed me as a human being. I can't remember my old self from that trip. It was that profound for people. So there are ways of, the real world ways of bringing new consciousness to current strategies, and I think people are craving. So I want to make sure this isn't totally theoretical. I want to talk about some current issues that are going on. So according to Gallup, what do you think the most fastest moving cultural change that's taken place in the United States in the last decade? Who said? Gay marriage, exactly. Gay marriage, unlike any other social issue, has gone like that. So that was an issue I was involved in, and I would argue that the reason why is because all levels of the spectrum were engaged. So if you're hearing this as a progressive, you're thinking, what? The traditional people opposed it. Actually, believe it or not, in that chart, it was the green level that opposed it first in the gay community. The progressives opposed it because they thought it was patriarchal and it was taking an old male system and putting it into a progressive movement. So they opposed it. And it was actually more traditional thinkers and made a traditional argument. This is about people, we are embracing a traditional institution marriage and we want to extend it to another group. Very different message. At the same time we were pushing that, so this is the early 90s, there was also an employment bill. The employment bill, called ENDA, had well over 60% of the public agreed with it. It was not that controversial. But the strategy they used was a green-only postmodern strategy, meaning if you don't support this bill, you're a bigot. That bill has not passed even today, to this day, when most of the Fortune 100 companies have non-discrimination policy. So you can see that by including the various folks at the various levels, you can actually move what look like progressive issues solely forward. What's the most successful global health response in the last 15 years? I hinted at it. And it's interesting, we don't really know this, but the response to AIDS in Africa by the United States was the largest expenditure of any country in aid in the world. And it's the second largest aid program since the Marshall Plan. And it literally saved millions of lives. What happened in that situation? So these are worlds that I was involved with. Evangelicals, do you think they'd be excited about it? We went to the evangelicals, we went to the pharmaceuticals, we went to the AIDS activists, we went to the African countries, we went to the Congressional Black Caucus, and put this hodgepodge of you would never think would work together on the strategy, and had tremendous success. One of the last times the two parties worked together in the United States on anything was the AIDS in Africa crisis. And then also, the other area where this is practically happening is in the social entrepreneur movement. Social entrepreneurs, which is where I spend most of my time, are people who have a world-changing idea and they're bringing investors to the table. What's so cool about this is, if you're a progressive, you're probably the nonprofit or the grassroots activist. You're more progressive. The investor is probably more conservative, usually maybe a Republican. And in the state of Michigan, we brought all those players together to focus, primarily in Detroit and Flint, but other parts. And everybody was involved and everybody won. Nobody saw this as a charity program for the poor and it helped. No one saw it that way. And no one saw this as bringing investors in. No, horrible, money, business. They certainly had some of those biases, but bringing them all together, we actually addressed the big issue. So Michigan became the first state in the United States to have a statewide social entrepreneur competition. A year later, it's received $1.1 million of investments for the winners, the 10 winners that won in the competition. So there are models. I don't want to talk pie in the sky. There are ways, but can you see how it's bringing all the various voices to the table? That's the skill set. So to your question earlier, where would these come from? One person here, Jeffrey Van Dyke, is sort of a leader in the field of this coaching. He just moved to the Los Angeles area, but he's originally from San Francisco. He's been one of the leaders in the purpose movement. But I just put up a bunch of folks that are kind of leading it. Authors, Ken Wilber, this is Father Richard Rohr, who does a daily message, a Franciscan priest. This gentleman, Jeff Salzman, does a weekly news program, free podcast, where he takes you through the world events in an integral way and explains what's going on. Some wonderful books. The collaborative operating system is a new way of how we play together. And I'm very proud that the leadership of Wayfarers Chapel has 3 leaders, and they went through this training with Rachel Connerly to figure out a different way to operate. How could we operate together? So there are thinkers. It's still, like people said earlier, you kind of have to pull it together yourself right now. You kind of have to find the right people. But imagine if theological schools or schools were teaching this. This will be the case in the future. This will be so necessary. But right now, the pioneers are figuring this out themselves. And again, anybody wants the slides, we'll give it to you at the end. And I'm happy to come back to this slide because I know it's a lot of information. I see people writing things down. So in my conclusion, I think the world is facing tremendous challenges. The leadership models that we're using are not working, and we can't change the world without God. We're going to have to bring God back in. We lost it in that scientific material world. We're going to bring spirit back in. It's not going to be the God of the religions we knew, in the past. It's a different spirit. But I believe that development is going to have to come in spiritually, and so thus spiritual entrepreneurs. And then we can bring heaven to earth. Thank you very much. So now, I'll leave that. I saw some people writing notes. I'll leave that up. Questions? Concerns? Anna?
So I'm interested in your initial observations of what's not working. Hierarchical is one of the main points which I resonate with. And so I'm interested that your levels of consciousness diagram is hierarchical. And I'm just wondering how you are reconciling the new leadership model with going up and down, and if there might be some other more less hierarchical, more cyclical ways to diagram the levels of consciousness and bringing together various approaches.
Yes. So that's, I think, probably the biggest critique, mainly from the green level, again, on integral theory, is that if hierarchy is bad, isn't this a hierarchy? And I think what it's saying, it's not always bad. I mean, evolution is one thing growing into another thing, a plant to a tree. That's an evolutionary process. So you could look at it, it's evolving. I think the important thing now is to look at those levels and say that the evolved person in that process can embrace all those various levels. But hierarchy, kind of becoming a very bad word, but we would say a child's development is a good example. We would say that a child star who is forced at 6 to behave like an 18-year-old, we've all seen the documentaries. We know where that's going, right? Poor Justin Bieber or whoever, I feel sorry for them. When kids are put into those roles, if they skip the levels, so there's a hierarchy there, but it's not necessarily a hierarchy. When I'm talking about hierarchical thinking in the past, I'm really, maybe a better way of saying is command, control, almost a military view. The boss, I'm in charge, you work for me, this is what you're going to do. That model, I believe, is unhelpful, but it's a great question.
I do totally agree with you with collaboration and things of that sort. That we need to collaborate. But I definitely want to hear more on how you feel, because I feel divide and conquer is still out there. And when people really look at the roots of their particular problem, their movement, it's all integral. So how do you see us working and trying to get people to realize that your problem is also my problem?
So everybody could hear it. Essentially, I think what you're saying is we still live in a very much a win-lose world. And the idea of saying everybody wins, and I've said it to very many people in many situations, and they'll say, I get what you do, I get everything you're saying, but the idea that both of us can win, I can't get that. That doesn't make any sense. That sounds pie in the sky, it sounds kumbaya, it sounds Gandhi. Okay, it's good in theory, but in my real life, I need to. So I do think that's an evolutionary issue. I think you can speak to the person at their level, and I think you have to respond to the energy of a certain level with that energy of where they are, and share something new and help them on that process. But if you're putting together a strategy and you have people at those different levels, I think you have to accept that they're at that level and make it a win for them. And they might see that, oh my gosh, I won, which is what I really wanted, but their winning was not as interesting to me. I don't care about that, but that's okay. If you're looking at the broader strategy, everybody could win. But it is one of the, what you're really getting at, I think, is, so living in this real world where these other systems are still in place, how do you move forward when you encounter all the different levels?
Because poverty and climate change are one and the same.
Exactly.
So, that's when you start looking at the latest steps, and I feel that that's when you can start putting together collaborations.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I've been thinking of this. It's more like a comment. This, for some reason, is making me think of the movie A Girl in the Cafe. I don't know if you saw that film.
I'm sorry?
A Girl in the Cafe.
No, I didn't
It's
see
about the G8 conference in Reykjavik, Iceland, some years back. And it's basically, we are the generation that can make the change. And if we don't, then future generations are going to look back on us and shame on you guys when you could have done something about the global hunger and that, and we didn't do anything.
I agree. I think this is probably the most exciting time in the history of the world because of this new development that we're going through. So I agree with you. And to your second point that you made, strategists today are using something called collective impact when they're approaching a problem. So the city of Cleveland, collective impact means they bring together all the funders, all the areas, and they bring them together in their strategy. This is a radical new idea. It's kind of the hot idea of social change. But it's to your point, to view hunger in a child without looking at poverty, without looking at the economic system, without looking at all the other things, you're only going to put a Band-Aid and solve it for the moment. You're not doing systems change. This is really systems change. It's looking at a much more complex system. But in the past, that broad view basically fritzed out our operating system. I can't go there. I can only do what I can do here. And we are at time. So thank you very much. Thanks for your questions. You're engaging with me as I was talking. I really appreciated it, everybody. And I'm happy to talk with you if you have any questions after. But thank you so much for coming on this beautiful day. Let's change the world and let's bring heaven to earth. Thank you.